Hello readers by eyes and by ears, this is Mari Chen and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are doing the continuation of the reading of Thousand Autumns or Qianqiu by Meng Xi Shi. We will be reading chapters 19 through 21. Enjoy! Chapter 19, Inquiry. And what if I insist on leaving? Asked Shen Qiao. Instead of answering, Yu Ai countered. This is where you grew up, and the martial siblings you grew up with are here. Can you really bear to abandon Xuandu Mountain? To leave like this? Yu Ai tried both reason and affection to move him, but Shen Qiao was still. If you're asking if I'll work with the Gokturks, I will not. When he saw that he wouldn't budge, Yu Ai's tone grew even colder. What difference does it make if you agree or not? 4 of the 7 Xuandu Mountain elders are already in favor of my plan. The other 3 are in secluded cultivation and unconcerned with mundane affairs. As for our martial siblings, Da Shuxiong is too kind-hearted to take a side, so it's useless to talk to him. Su Shudi and Xiao Shimei will be very happy to see you again, but that doesn't mean they'll agree with you. It's imperative that we reform Xuandu Mountain. I won't watch our sect suffer in a slow decline. Not in my lifetime, and neither will they. How else do you think I managed to become acting sect leader and stabilize things so quickly? Could I have made all this happen alone, without their tacit support and approval? You, Shitsuan, even the older generations of sect leaders, your ideas aren't going to work anymore. How can Xuandu Mountain only focus on our moral purity when there's so much unrest in the world? The night was silent. Even the birds had disappeared completely from the sky. The wind had subsided. The leaves rustled no more. It was as if all the world had come to a standstill. At some point, the bright moon had ducked behind the clouds, drowning heaven and earth in darkness. The candle in Yu Ai's hand flickered, slowly growing fainter until it finally went out. Ever since Shen Qiao had gone blind, night and day made no difference to him. He was also a human being. He felt pain when he was injured and brooded when he was troubled. But he'd always believed that hope lay ahead, and he was willing to face any obstacle with an optimistic mind. Though many heavy doubts had weighed his heart after he recovered his memories, he didn't become disheartened or discouraged. He still wanted to go to Xuandu Mountain, to get an explanation, face to face. But at this moment, with the truth laid out before him, Shen Qiao felt a deep exhaustion rise up inside him all at once. It was as if there was a hand clutching him, trying to drag him down into the freezing sea. Involuntarily, he clenched the bamboo cane in his hand. When Yu Ai saw the expression on Shen Qiao's face, it did anguish him a bit. But at this point, he felt that there were some things he had to say clearly. Shuxiong, nobody wants to wallow in solitude. Xuandu Mountain is clearly the world's #1 Taoist sect, and it has the strength to support an enlightened ruler who can help Taoism influence the world. So why must we act like hermits and hide ourselves away in the mountain? Everyone on Xuandu Mountain agrees except you. You're the one who's being too naive. Shen Qiao drew a deep breath. Kunye is of the Gokturks. By working with him, surely you don't intend to give the Gokturks an inroad into the Central Plains. Of course not, said Yu Ai. As I said, working with Kunye is only one step in my plan. No matter how much I wish for Xuandu Mountain's return to the secular world, I would never side with the Gokturks. The Gokturks are ferocious and brutal, not enlightened rulers at all. Shen Qiao's brow pinched. He had a vague suspicion that Yu Ai had embroiled Xuandu Mountain in some sort of grand scheme, but with his mind in such disarray, he couldn't fathom what it was. Now that you returned, we can go back to how it was before, Yu Ai said. No distance between us, close as brothers. Your eyes haven't recovered yet, and you still have internal injuries. Just climbing the mountain must have taken a lot of effort. How far can you manage to get in such a state? Xuandu Mountain is your home. Shen Qiao slowly shook his head. You walk your bright and glorious path. I'll walk my lone wooden plank. I'd rather not be a figurehead sect leader. From now on, he was about to say something callous about tearing his robe and breaking off relationships, but then scenes of their childhood flashed before his eyes, the two of them growing up together. Their friendship was still vivid in his mind. A few words claiming it was lost wouldn't be enough to truly dissolve their bond. Shun Qiao released a soundless sigh. In the end, he said nothing. He only pressed his lips together tightly, then turned and left. Of all the martial siblings under Qi Fengge's tutelage, Shun Qiao was the most talented, but with the top martial artist in the world as their master, the rest weren't too shabby either. Qi Fengge only accepted disciples who were naturally gifted, with excellent foundations. If Shun Qiao was at the height of his powers, then Yu Ai might not have been able to stop him, but Yu Ai didn't hesitate to move against him now. Without a second thought, he flashed right in front of Shun Qiao, blocking his way. "Don't go, Shishong," he said severely, and he reached out, meaning to knock Shun Qiao unconscious. But Shun Qiao must have anticipated this move. He stepped back before Yu Ai reached him, raising his bamboo cane as if to parry. Of course, Yu Ai didn't take Shun Qiao's defense seriously. He reached out to grab the bamboo cane. He was sure he'd catch it too, but somehow he came up empty-handed. The bamboo cane slipped away from his grip, advancing instead of retreating, and struck at his wrist. Yu Ai frowned minutely and flicked his fingers, reaching out to grab Shun Qiao's shoulder with his other hand. His sleeves rustled in the still air, and he moved behind Shun Qiao to block his path of retreat. Yu Ai caught Shun Qiao square on the shoulder. He'd used a fair deal of force, and slight pain jolted through Shun Qiao at the contact. But he paid it no heed and used the bamboo cane in his hand to strike out at Yu Ai's waist. There was an old injury there from when Yu Ai had fallen from a tree as a child. He'd suffered fractures, and although they later healed, the memory of pain left a small shadow on Yu Ai's mind. He moved instinctively to avoid the hit. Shun Qiao had only recovered 3/10 of his strength and was no match for Yu Ai. But the two of them had known each other since their youth, so despite his blindness, Shun Qiao still knew every possible move Yu Ai might make, every trick he might employ, like the back of his hand. Shun Qiao was also certain that Yu Ai didn't want to kill him, so he attacked without the slightest misgiving. Of course, Yu Ai knew Shun Qiao well as well. They exchanged blows for a while, and Yu Ai began to grow agitated. Not wanting to drag this out any further, he aimed a palm strike directly at Shun Qiao's shoulder, this time using true qi. The palm strike swept up a wind before it, and at the sound of it, Shun Qiao automatically raised his bamboo cane to block it. But it was futile. The true qi came right at his chest, and with a snap, his bamboo cane broke in two. Shun Qiao stumbled back several steps, staggered twice, and then fell to the ground. "Ah Qiao, stop this and come home with me. Once Xiao Shimei and the others hear that you've returned, they'll be overjoyed." Yu Ai took a couple of steps forward, preparing to pull the other man up. Shun Qiao said nothing. Yu Ai had just grasped him by the wrist when he saw something sweep towards him, as forceful as a tempest. It was the broken piece of bamboo cane that Shun Qiao was holding. Shun Qiao had been saving up his power, holding it back, just waiting for his opponent to let his guard down. Yu Ai hadn't thought that Shun Qiao, injured and blind as he was, would still have the strength for a counter-attack. He didn't know that Shun Qiao was only at 3/10 of his usual strength. Yu Ai dared not risk a direct hit when he saw how fiercely that bamboo cane moved. It came at him with power as frigid as an icy spring, cold enough to pierce to the marrow. He dodged to the side. Shun Qiao didn't press the attack. He withdrew his palm and turned, retreating back down the path straight away. Shun Qiao had grown up there, and he could still manage to distinguish his surroundings, even if he couldn't see them. Stepping lightly with his qinggong, he rushed onwards with Yu Ai in hot pursuit. Without looking back, Shun Qiao pinpointed Yu Ai by sound, then flung the broken piece of bamboo cane behind him. Determined to keep him at Xuandu Mountain, Yu Ai was done holding back. With a furl of his sleeves, he flung the broken bamboo right back at Shun Qiao. Shun Qiao heard the sound of something whistling through the air from behind him just as the bamboo cane grazed past his shoulder. It sliced through his clothes, and blood welled from the wound immediately. Shen Qiao chose to endure the pain. He kept going forward, not evading, even though he staggered as he went. In the blink of an eye, Yu Ai caught up to him and lashed out with a palm strike. Shen Qiao had no time to dodge. The blow hit him square in the back. Blood gushed from his mouth, and he fell face first to the ground. After that, all he could do was curl up and gasp for breath. "Stop running!" Yu Ai reached down to yank him to his feet, truly angry now. "When did you get so stubborn? I don't want to hurt you, so why won't you just listen?" Who wouldn't run when they knew they were about to be held captive? Huh, only a fool. A mocking laugh, sinister and cold, rang out from somewhere in the darkness. Alarmed, Yu Ai stopped and looked around, yet found no trace of the other man. "What lowly scoundrel is hiding there? Come out!" I used to think that Chifengge's disciples had to be at least halfway decent, considering that he himself was the heavenly pride of his generation. But who would have guessed? Shen Qiao being nearly crippled is one thing, but to think that Yu Ai, the acting sect leader, is only mediocre in martial arts. If Chifengge hears about this in the netherworld, I fear it'll disturb his eternal rest. In the next moment, Yan Wushi appeared, ridicule and contempt written all over his face. Even with his martial arts, Yu Ai couldn't tell where he'd come from or where he'd been hiding. He was terribly alarmed, but he kept his expression calm. "May I know this distinguished master's esteemed name?" he asked. "For what important reason have you come to visit Xuandu Mountain in the middle of the night? If you are one of my master's old friends, I must ask you to come to the main hall for tea." "Xuandu Mountain without Chifengge is far too dull. I have no need to drink your tea, and in any case, you're not qualified to drink tea with me." Yu Ai intended to bring Xuandu Mountain into the secular world, so of course he'd done quite a bit of homework. He searched his mind. Judging by how presumptuous and arrogant this man was, and how uncanny his martial arts were, Yu Ai landed on the name. "Yan Wushi? You're the demon lord Yan Wushi." Yan Wushi frowned. That title, Demon Lord, this venerable one quite dislikes it. Yu Ai's face was grave. He skipped right past whatever Yan Wushi liked or disliked. "Dare I ask what business Yan Wushi has on Xuandu Mountain? This humble Yu is currently dealing with the sect's internal affairs, so he's unable to offer proper hospitality. He asks sect leader Yan to visit again, in the daytime." "I can come whenever I want. Since when do you have the right to order me around?" Yu Ai had been startled by Yan Wushi's sudden appearance. Now that he had time to think about it carefully, it occurred to him that Xuandu Mountain wasn't a place someone could barge into at will. Even a grandmaster of martial arts like Yan Wushi or Ruyan Kehui couldn't just enter whenever they wanted, as if they were strolling onto some empty, unguarded plot of land. The only possibility was that he'd come via the narrow route that hugged the back mountain's cliff. He whipped around and looked at Shen Qiao. Shen Qiao had his head slightly lowered, so Yu Ai couldn't see his expression. Then he placed his hand on a nearby tree trunk, straining to stand while using it for support. He looked as if a gust of wind would blow him over. But then the wind really did get stronger, whipping at his robes until they rustled and flapped, and he simply stood there, firmly rooted, as if even 100 calamities wouldn't be enough to break him. When Yu Ai saw that Shen Qiao wasn't at all surprised by Yan Wushi's appearance, a possibility occurred to him, one that left him shocked and furious. "Ah Qiao, how could you get involved with people from the demonic sects?" At that, Shen Qiao let out a slow breath that carried the scent of blood. He wiped the smears from the corner of his mouth and rasped, "You've colluded with the Gok Turks, so why shouldn't I keep company with people from the demonic sects?" Chapter 20. Enjoying the Show. Shen Qiao's words rendered Yu Ai temporarily speechless, and Yan Wushi just had to fan the flames. Chifengge let Hulugu walk away. Then Hulugu goes and takes a disciple who throws Chifengge's disciple off a cliff. He said nonchalant. Meanwhile, Chifengge accepted a disciple, but that disciple was so ambitious that he colluded with the Gokturks against his own Shushong to make himself sect leader. I reckon Chifengge would leap right up out of his coffin if he caught wind of this going down in the Netherland. He'd be furious. The taunting stoked Yu Ai's anger. He barely managed to tamp it down as he coldly replied, "It's rather impolite of sect leader Yan to arrive uninvited in the middle of the night. This Yu still has family matters that he must attend to, so forgive him for being unable to see you off." "What a joke," said Yan Wushi. "My venerable self will come and go as I wish. There is no place in the world that can stop me. If Chifengge tried that, my venerable self might leave some of his dignity intact. But you? Who do you think you are?" Nobody had ever said anything like this to Yu Ai in his life. He was hot-blooded as a youth, and it was only under Shen Qiao's subtle influence that he'd grown gentler over the years. Now his old fiery temper was provoked and rekindling. His fingers twitched inside his sleeves. At first he wanted to summon others to help him, but in the end, he thought better of it. Shen Qiao was popular on Xuandu Mountain, with an excellent reputation. It was true that the others approved of Yu Ai's proposal and shared the hope that Xuandu Mountain could enter the secular world anew and participate in the contest for reunification by supporting a ruler. But that didn't mean they wanted their leadership to change. Not to mention, there was a decent chance the elders and martial siblings would soften at the sight of Shen Qiao, given the way he looked at the moment. They might just change their minds. If that happened, the situation could spiral into chaos. Considering that, he shook off his sleeve. A long sword appeared in his hand. This was one of the 3 swords Chifengge had passed down to his disciples. Shanhe Tongbei he gave to Shen Qiao. His youngest female disciple, Gu Hengbo, received the sword Tianwei Sheichun, and the 3rd sword, Jun Sibuqi. That was the one Yu Ai held now. A swing of the sword shot rainbowed ribbons of brilliant, billowing light out into the dark, dazzling, but uncanny. Only one who'd honed Xuandu Mountain's Azure Wave sword technique to its ultimate level could create such a sword glare. Beam after beam came in great swells that built momentum relentlessly until they arrived like a tempest, powerful and wrathful enough to swallow heaven and earth. In the eye of that storm, his opponent would feel like a deluge was pouring down around him, the raindrops violently crashing down until they seemed on the verge of shattering the ground itself. A frigid sweeping gale sliced through the air like knives, filling all with terror as the blades slashed through bones and speared into bowels. At some point, Yan Wushi had risen up into the air. At first glance, it looked like he'd been blown back by the raging winds, his feet floating off the ground. He kept one hand behind his back and held the other out flat before him, palm first. With a furl and a flick of his sleeve, he first swept away most of the barrage of sword rain, then extended a single index finger. It was the same finger he'd used against Yu Shengyan beneath the cliff at Banbu Peak. The difference was, against Yu Shengyan, he'd only used half his strength. Now, he was using 8 parts of 10. The sword glare that had blotted out the heavens condensed. The tip of Yu Ai's sword twirled once in a ring of light, then dove to meet Yan Wushi's finger. 2 torrents of true qi met at their point and exploded, the blast radiating out around them. In the center, their wide sleeves whipped and unfurled. Outside the circle, things were worse. Shen Qiao had dodged to the side when Yu Ai and Yan Wushi attacked each other, but that wasn't enough to avoid the shock wave. He almost lost his balance when the impact came. The sword's point was infused with true qi, and it created a turbulent upsurge. Like a massive rushing wave, it broke and crashed over Yan Wushi's head. The Azure Wave sword technique was true to its name. Chifengge came up with this technique while overlooking the Great Sea to the east. Over the years, he made some improvements to it, and eventually it became the introductory martial arts practiced by all Xuandu Mountain disciples. But even though it was introductory, the distinction between superior and inferior martial arts became apparent when they practiced the same sword technique. Such was the case with Yu. He'd attained the level where authentic understanding of the spirit surpasses rigid mimicry of the form, and had integrated much of his own understanding of swordplay into the Azure Wave sword technique. He'd achieved true, perfect command of it. He and his sword were nearly one and the same. Yet his attack was thwarted by one single finger of Yan Wusher's hand. Close observation would reveal that Yan Wusher's finger was not still, nor simply pressed against the point of the blade. To the contrary, he was moving incredibly fast, too fast to be seen. So while it looked like he was motionless, in truth, his hand had never stopped moving. His finger darted as if it could see precisely where to go. It lightly grazed several spots, and each just happened to be the weak points in Yu's barrier of true qi. Just then, Yu remembered the review of the world's top martial arts experts that his master Qi Fengge had given them when he'd still been alive. Yan Wusher was mentioned in that lesson. Back then, everyone thought Qi Fengge's greatest rival was the Gokturk master Hulugu, but Qi Fengge said that Yan Wusher's talents would see him surpass Hulugu within a few years. He might even be capable of defeating Qi Fengge himself. He'd seen that Yan Wusher's martial arts had already progressed past the point of strict adherence to set forms. It changed as it pleased him to change. For most people, the Zhu-Yang strategy was the key to deepening their martial arts as they strove towards the pinnacle of martial prowess. But for Yan Wusher, it was just a point of reference. Instead of emulating the Zhu-Yang strategy, instead of recultivating his qi from scratch, he simply used it to patch up the deficiencies in his own martial abilities. Yan Wusher's martial arts included the infamous spring water's finger technique. After they fought, Qi Fengge used 2 lines of poetry to describe it. The spring waters ripple, my reflection embraced, my wishful fancies crumble, only ash remains. When Yu had first heard those lines, he couldn't grasp their meaning. They'd seemed to be about a woman lamenting her long-faded feelings, but he finally understood what the second line meant. Because accompanying his opponent's finger technique was a towering tide of true qi, not only did it block his attack, it nearly collapsed the barrier Yu had painstakingly constructed using the qi from his sword. The feeling of it, the pressure, was exactly as Qi Fengge had described. His wishful fancies had crumbled, and now only ash remained. Yu was forced to push the transmission of his sword qi to its limit. But just a few moments later, his attack went up like an explosion of smoke and haze, its dense vapor suspended in the air. Wind burst forth from nowhere, and giant boulders split in a thunderous roar. A whining buzz filled Shen Qiao's ears. For a moment, he couldn't hear anything else. On such a silent night, the explosion's roar alarmed the other people on Xuandu Mountain. Light lamps flickered to life in the distance, one by one, and quite a few people threw on their clothes and headed for the source of the commotion. Things had progressed far beyond what Yu had anticipated. He wanted to finish this fight quickly and quietly, but he hadn't accounted for Yan Wusher interfering. The situation had slipped out of his control. Both of them ceased their attacks, and Yu backed up 3 steps, while Yan Wusher backed up 2. But Yu had gone all out in their fight, while Yan Wusher used only 8 parts of his strength. Everyone knew who'd come out on top. Despite everything, Yan Wusher remained composed. He had a look on his face like he was greatly entertained. Yu gritted his teeth and didn't speak. Part of him welcomed the others, since the combined strength of several elders would surely be enough to detain that trespassing madman Yan Wusher, and that in turn would keep Shen Qiao from leaving. But another part of him didn't want anyone else from Xuandu Mountain to see Shen Qiao. He was still thinking it over when the first person arrived. It was Qi Fengge's first disciple, Tan Yuanchun. He was the Shixiong of Shen Qiao and Yu Ai. His abilities were only average and his temperament mild. A peacemaker when faced with conflict, a bleeding heart who couldn't offend anyone. His disposition and martial ability made him unsuited for sect leader, but his forgiving and charitable nature earned him the deep respect of all his martial siblings, Shen Qiao included. After Shen Qiao became sect leader, Tan Yuanchun was made an elder and busied himself every day with the education of the next generation of disciples. You, Shudi? Tan Yuanchun found Yu Ai with a single glance, looking rather surprised. That sound just now was from you? And who's this? Huan Yue's sect leader Yan, said Yu Ai. When he heard Yu Ai's offhand introduction, Tan Yuanchun drew in a cold gasp. Why was the demon lord of the demonic sects here? Yan Wushi was in a good mood. He even took the initiative to greet Tan Yuanchun. Your Qi Fengge's first disciple. Years ago, I fought your master and lost to him, but now his disciples are all completely useless. Would you like to have a try too? Tan Yuanchun was speechless. Yan Wushi turned to look at Yu Ai, who said severely, Sect leader Yan might be peerless in martial arts, but Xuandu Mountain's numbers are still enough to keep one man here. Does sect leader Yan find Xuandu Mountain's scenery so spectacular that he can't bear to go? Yan Wushi sneered a bit. Xuandu Mountain without Qi Fengge is utterly worthless in my eyes. He looked at Shen Qiao and spoke with ridicule. Still unwilling to leave? Are you waiting for your Shidi to imprison you so the two of you can chat about your friendship? Only then did Tan Yuanchun notice that another person was there, standing beneath a nearby tree. He'd failed to notice the other person. He was half concealed in shadows, his breathing was faint, and Yan Wushi had caught his attention by speaking first. Just one glance shocked him. Jiangjiao Shidi, he blurted out. Shen Qiao, supporting himself with the tree trunk, nodded in the direction of his voice. Has Da Shishong been well? Tan Yuanchun was surprised and delighted. Taking a couple of steps forward, he asked, Are you all right? When did you return? How did... Yu Ai stopped him. Da Shishong. Cut off. Tan Yuanchun remembered what Yan Wushi had just said. Tan Yuanchun whipped around to face Yu Ai. What exactly is going on here? It was Shen Qiao who answered. Da Shishong, is it true that you're planning to elect Yu Shidi as the new sect leader? Tan Yuanchun appeared troubled. He looked at Yu Ai, then back at Shen Qiao. He wasn't good at finding the diplomatic things to say, so he went with the truth. While you were gone, we've relied on Yu Shidi to handle our internal affairs. After all, he assisted you with everything before, so he's the only one who understands Xuandu Mountain's workings from top to bottom. After you fell from the cliff, several elders held a discussion and decided to let Yu Shidi take over as acting sect leader first, until... Well, it's good that you're back. Recuperate now. The rest will be discussed after. There will be plenty of time for that. Shen Qiao understood very well that if he truly remained here today, he would never hold the position of sect leader again. Not with his loss to Kunye and his own grievous injuries on top of that. Even if the others didn't object, he himself wouldn't have the face to take up the title again. Xuandu's violent palace would remain in the hands of Yu Ai, and regardless of whether or not Shen Qiao stuck around, he wouldn't be able to stop him from working with the Gokturks. In fact, in his current condition, he'd only be placing himself at the mercy of others. Knowing this drew a silent sigh from him. All his hesitation was gone. This Shen asked sect leader Yan to bring him away with you. Ah, Qiao! Shudi! Both of them spoke at the same time, Yu Ai with anger, Tan Yuanchun with shock. He didn't understand when Shen Qiao could have gotten involved with people of the demonic sects. Yan Wushi raised an eyebrow. He seemed unsurprised by Yan Wushi's decision. In fact, he looked like he found it exceptionally amusing. It's not too late for you to turn back, he said deliberately. Indistinct lamplight glowed in the distance. Moving closer and closer, the Xuandu Mountain disciples running toward them, one after another. A blind man's ears were extraordinarily sensitive. Although Shen Qiao could see little, he could hear them approaching. He shook his head. No. When he saw Yan Wushi preparing to leave with Shen Qiao, Yu Ai was furious and appalled. He raised his sword, moving to stop them. Wait! Yan Wushi neither dodged nor avoided. Instead, he grabbed Shen Qiao by the lower back and shoved him forward, making him the target of Yu Ai's attack in an instant. Tan Yuanchun was horrified. San Shudi, stop! Alarmed, Yu Ai quickly withdrew his attack and backed away. Yan Wushi bellowed with laughter. Then, in a blink of an eye, he and Shen Qiao disappeared without a trace. Only the sound of his laughter remained, echoing in the emptiness. Yu Ai exploded with rage. That shameless madman! Chapter 21, Altercation. Of course, all martial experts would show at least a few characteristics befitting such a figure. Some couldn't set aside their pride, some the prestige of their position. Most people of high status and standing, for the sake of their own dignity, wouldn't have it in them to use someone as a human shield. Only someone like Yan Wushi, who could destroy the Zhuyang strategy scroll without a second thought, could pull off such a shameless move. No wonder Yu Ai was hopping mad, and Shen Qiao himself was at a loss for words. Yan Wushi brought him all the way down the mountain and straight through Xuandu town until they arrived at a relay station that stood where they'd first entered the outskirts of town. Here grew a sparse patch of trees, but it was still fairly open. He set Shen Qiao down. Shen Qiao cupped his hands. Many thanks. He'd been injured during his fight with Yu Ai. His whole body was full of blocked qi and stagnant blood. Only now, after some time had passed, did he feel the warmth slowly return to his body, sensation flowing back into his arms and legs. Yan Wushi, however, gave him a discourteous sneer. So, what exactly was the point of your trip to Xuandu Mountain? It only confirmed what I said before. If a person stands to gain from something, their heart is worthless. Your martial siblings, people you grew up with, they didn't hesitate to betray you when it served their interests. They let you fall from a cliff without a single care, just to secure the title of sect leader. Chifeng boasted that his sect was righteous and just, honest and candid. But his disciples conduct themselves like they were taught in one of our demonic sects. Truly incredible. Of course, he knew that Xuandu Mountain had searched tirelessly for Shen Qiao after he fell from the mountain, and that they'd come up empty-handed because he himself had rescued Shen Qiao. But Yan Wushi had no reason to speak up on their behalf. He was more than happy to see Shen Qiao become despondent, to watch him go from a soft-hearted, downtrodden sect leader to a man who hated and resented all the world. But Shen Qiao didn't pick up the conversation. He sought out a boulder nearby and slowly lowered himself onto it. Yu Ai tended towards stubbornness and was strongly utilitarian. He strove for perfection in everything he did, and he'd been that way since he was a child. If he hadn't been at Xuandu Mountain, he might have been another Yan Wushi by now. But all these years, he put his heart and soul into Xuandu Mountain without even a bit of hidden selfishness. The martial siblings all loved each other devotedly, and it was enough to warm even the hardest of hearts. Furthermore, Yu Ai wasn't Yan Wushi. Before his betrayal, Shen Qiao would never have thought he would do such a thing. Even if Chifeng was revived, he'd likely think the same thing. Yu Ai had engineered his defeat at Kunye's hands. He let Shen Qiao lose to a Gokturk in full view of everyone. With his reputation in pieces, Yu Ai had simply stepped into Shen Qiao's position. It wasn't as if anyone would think him unqualified, and it'd be smooth sailing from then on. After all, even if Shen Qiao were still alive, he wouldn't have the face to ask to continue as the sect leader. All of this sounded very reasonable, but combined with Yu Ai's sincere agitation when he'd spoken of his own troubles, and that he'd said he was doing it all so that Xuandu Mountain could stand above the other sects in the world, then things started to look a bit odd. If the troubles Yu Ai spoke of were real, and he really did have another reason for his actions, then he couldn't have just been talking about colluding with Kunye to throw Shenqiao off the cliff. He was definitely working with the Gokturks on even greater and more important matters. Shenqiao furrowed his brow, his head prickling with pain as if it were being stabbed with needles. No matter which way he turned it over in his mind, he still failed to understand. There had been frequent regime changes since the Jin dynasty's move south and the uprising of the Five Barbarians. But even though the Zhou and the Qi carried strong northern influences, they'd still followed the Han way of doing things and so had gradually acculturated. If they were the ones who unified the world, then people would find it acceptable, though perhaps with some difficulty. But if instead it were the likes of the Gokturk royal court, still living like brutish nomads, grazing their livestock on the grasslands and periodically invading the Central Plains, they weren't considered enlightened rulers by any stretch of imagination. The image of the Gokturks as capricious, coarse, and thuggish was deeply entrenched in the hearts of the people of the Central Plains. Yu Ai would never risk such universal condemnation if there wasn't some absolutely astronomical benefit to be had. So then, what was Yu Ai plotting? And what would he get out of it from the Gokturks? Or, one could say, what would Xuandu Mountain get out of it? Shenqiao did not bring such things to Yan Wushi for discussion. Even though the two of them were now much closer, they still weren't friends. Plus, Yan Wushi was mercurial, his morality unpredictable. It was foolish to seek sincere advice when they had such a shallow bond. Shenqiao could only mull it over by himself, turning the issue this way and that within his mind. But no matter how he mulled, it felt like there was a thin piece of window paper between him and the answer. He couldn't see through well enough to untangle it. Had enough rest? Yan Wushi said suddenly. Shenqiao looked up, nonplussed. His distraction left him with a bit of a guileless expression. If you've had enough rest, let's fight. Shenqiao took a long moment to digest that. He forced a wry smile. Sex Leader Yan, how could I possibly be your match? Didn't you prove that already? Baffled, Yan Wushi replied, Why else would I bring you with me? What's it to me if you live or die? If I just wanted the Zhuyang strategy scroll, I would have gone straight to Xuandu Mountain myself. Why bring along deadweight like you? But you have 2 Zhuyang volumes within you. It's only a matter of time before you regain your martial arts. Such good fortune doesn't come to just anyone. For a long time, I've wanted to study Tao Hongjing's martial arts by using someone proficient with the Zhuyang strategy. I can't fight against myself, though, and I certainly can't go hunt down that bald donkey Xue Ting to practice against. Doesn't that make you the most suitable candidate? The corners of Shenqiao's mouth twitched. He had no idea what to say. After a while, he finally replied, I only have 3/10 of my strength back, and I was injured when I fought Yu Ai just now. I fear my ability will be lacking. That's why I've granted you a great mercy, letting you sit there and rest for a while. I'm beginning to feel like being detained on Xuandu Mountain wasn't that bad an option, Shenqiao said helplessly. You've already regained your memory, said Yan Wushi. That means you're able to remember that volume of Zhuyang strategy you learned before and use it at will. Furthermore, reading the other volume at Chuyuan Temple was enough for you to absorb it in its entirety, taking your skills to the next level. Shenqiao thought about it, then nodded with sincerity. That's indeed the case. Taking this into account, although Yan Wushi's motives weren't pure, and he'd repeatedly used Shenqiao for his own purposes as well as simply to amuse himself, he still felt like he needed to show more gratitude. I haven't properly thanked Sect Leader Yan since leaving the villa, he said. If not for you, I fear I'd have become a lost soul at the base of Banbu Peak. What you should thank is the Zhuyang strategy's true tea that's inside your body, said Yan Wushi. If not for that, I wouldn't have bothered to save you." It was a rather bleak conversation, but Shen Qiao replied in good cheer. "All right, I will go burn some incense for Shitsun to thank his esteemed self for passing the Juyang strategy down to me. I couldn't sense any of the Juyang strategy's true qi within Yu Ai's body when he fought, so I believe Qi Fengge only passed it down to you." Shen Qiao nodded. "That's right. I was alone that day. Shitsun conveyed to me the volume of Lost Soul and ordered me to memorize it through recitation. He forbade me from writing it down. It's rumored that Xuandu Mountain has a Juyang strategy scroll hidden away, but I don't know if it's still there." Yan Wushi found this very interesting. Didn't Qi Fengge wish for Xuandu Mountain's legacy to be passed down through the generations? Didn't he want each and every disciple to excel? Why did he only show the volume of Lost Soul to you? Shen Qiao replied slowly. "I asked Shitsun about this matter before, but he didn't answer. Shitsun and Perfected Master Tao were old friends in life. I heard that after Perfected Master Tao completed the Juyang strategy, he was filled with regret. He thought that if the book got out, it would lead to endless conflict and strife in the world, that many people would die as a result. I think perhaps Shitsun felt the same way, to a certain degree. He wanted his old friend's life work to be passed down, but he also didn't want it to spread too far, lest the world fight and kill each other over it. That's why he made such a contradictory decision." Yan Wushi snorted in disdain. "What foolish soft-heartedness. Qi Fengge was always like that. He didn't finish Hulugu off when he fought and ended up leaving behind a disaster lying in wait for his successors. Peerless in martial arts, but with the heart of an indecisive woman. If that's how he felt, then why teach martial arts to the Xuandu Mountain disciples at all? Wouldn't it be better to change Xuandu Mountain into an ordinary Taoist monastery? If you wish for a world without war, start with yourself." His words were harsh and biting, but not completely without merit. Shen Qiao and his master were the same in one aspect, and that was their benevolent heart, always considerate and gentle toward others. But he and Qi Fengge also had their differences. These days, Shen Qiao wandered the outside world, and there he witnessed the impoverished livelihoods and the suffering of the common people, the powers of the world, and how they'd all been drawn into this game of chess. Seeing all this gradually changed Shen Qiao's mindset. He'd realized that Xuandu Mountain also stood in the dust of the mortal world, that it was impossible for them to peacefully detach themselves from worldly affairs. It was only a matter of time before they must enter the game themselves. It was a pity that he hadn't had time to make any reforms for Xuandu Mountain. Yu Ai jumped in to replace him and was intent on steering Xuandu Mountain in an unknown direction. Shen Qiao lowered his head, sinking into deep contemplation. But from nearby, Yan Wushi silently and without warning pointed his finger at Shen Qiao. Ever since Shen Qiao lost his vision, he deliberately trained his ears. Now he heard a faint, strange noise and quickly smacked the boulder as he sprung up, moving backwards with great speed. Xuandu Mountain's Qinggong was unmatched. When he executed this set of steps, called "A Rainbow Stretches Across the Heavens," his figure was like a lotus above the water, seeking gently back and forth beneath the wind's caress, or like a willow slowly unfurling its branches, the motion indescribably beautiful. One could already see the faint shadow of his power at its full height. Chapter 22. Spring Water's Finger Technique. The Spring Water's Finger Technique was one of the techniques that had made Yan Wushi famous. He defeated countless martial experts with it, and Qi Fengge had even picked out 2 lines of poetry to describe it, a clear sign that it was an exquisite technique. And Yan Wushi had only gotten better with time. But not many people knew that this finger technique was adapted from a sword technique. Yan Wushi had once been a sword master, and he had a sword that never left his side. But when he lost his sword and couldn't find a satisfactory replacement, he decided to use his finger as a substitute. It turned out to be a happy mistake, And using this, he created a finger technique with an achingly tender name. Only those who faced it would know of the raging tempest Shen Qiao was now up against. Someone with sharp eyes would see that Yan Wusher's movements were very slow, elegant, and gentle, as if he were merely brushing a leaf from his opponent's shoulders. But his finger was blurred with the afterimages of where it'd been, and it was impossible to determine exactly which of the images was his real hand. Shen Qiao was a blind man. Without visual distractions, the other senses sharpened. He felt a crushing mountainous pressure bearing down on him from all directions, threatening to flatten or pulverize him, its true qi overwhelming everything. The pressure wasn't uniform. It followed the movements of Yan Wusher's finger. Sometimes he felt it on his shoulder, sometimes it struck at his neck. It was fleeting, erratic, and impossible to defend against. Shen Qiao's whole body was enveloped in the pressure Yan Wusher had created. It was like he was surrounded by walls on all sides, the dense layers of true qi swelling in him like a tide. There was nowhere to advance nor retreat, and the moment his internal energy was depleted, Yan Wusher's finger would reach him, would touch him, gentle as spring water. That would mean his death. Shen Qiao had only 3/10 of his internal energy, leaving him below the Jianghu's second-rate experts. Normally, a martial artist at that level couldn't dream of surviving against Yan Wusher. But Shen Qiao did have an advantage: his Xuandu Mountain martial arts and the 2 volumes of Zhuyang strategy. Though there'd been too little time for him to completely integrate all he'd memorized, the return of his memory brought with it his knowledge of self-defense. No longer would he be completely passive like before. His sleeve raised, he too substituted his hand for a sword, forming a seal. This was the initiating gesture of the Azure Wave sword technique. The cool breeze gently blows. The Azure Wave sword technique was the same set of sword moves that Yu Ai had used in his duel against Yan Wusher. Though Xuandu Mountain was world famous, they didn't possess a large variety of martial arts. They only had 2 sets of sword techniques. This was because Qi Fengge believed martial arts were paramount like that. Like with many other principles, it was all about abstraction and reducing the complicated to the simple. True ingenuity was unassuming. Instead of amassing more and more moves, it was better to hone just 2 sets to their ultimate peak until a total control was achieved. The cool breeze gently blows, as its name implied, started with a gesture that was gentle and accommodating, like one was basking in a refreshing breeze. Lacking a sword, Shen Qiao used his fingers instead. Making this gesture, he finally felt a sense of familiarity from his past. True qi rose from his abdomen, flowing across the acupoints of his waist and up his spine before gathering at the base of his neck, then streaming down his arms and to his wrist. His opponent's true qi condensed into an ironclad enclosure that slammed towards him from all sides, and just as it closed in, Shen Qiao directed the flow of his qi to his fingertips. There was a white slash like a sword glare. This was sword qi. As the sword qi sliced forward, Shen Qiao switched tactics, imitating 3 parts in musical harmony from the Azure Wave sword technique. He sent out successive taps with his finger, and each one landed precisely on the nodes of the woven net Yan Wusher had formed with his true qi. With a roar, smoke roiled, haze billowed, and sparks dazzled upon the net. If their fight had an audience, they'd see an awe-inspiring, brilliant light shining between the 2. Shen Qiao, blind to such a sight, broke through his opponent's attack with only his mastery over qi. For the combatants, it seemed that a long time passed between Yan Wusher starting his offensive and Shen Qiao destroying it. But in reality, it happened in the blink of an eye. Yan Wusher was quite surprised, but in the next moment his expression changed to one of intent fascination. He switched from finger to palm, his body drifting like a floating cloud or a wraith. Yan Wusher struck 3 blows at Shen Qiao from 3 different directions. The three palm strikes struck in like a sea-born wind screaming through mountains, surging in vast torrents. They made Yen Wusher's first attack look like child's play. Now his elegant mask was torn off, and the savagery that lay beneath laid bare. Three palm strikes, three directions. Shenqiao was just one person with two hands. He couldn't possibly defend on three sides at once. He chose to retreat. Since he'd diffused Yan Wusher's first attack, there was no longer any true qi blocking the way behind him, but he'd only managed to back up a few steps before Yan Wusher's strike came within inches of his face. No matter how powerful Yan Wusher was, he was still only a human being. It was impossible for him to attack with three hands at once. They came in a sequence, albeit at a speed so ludicrously fast that nobody could have tracked it. But Shen Qiao could, because he was blind. A blind man need not see, only hear. Since his injury, he'd suffered many hardships that would have been unimaginable to him before, and these hardships looked all the more stark after his memories returned. At times, Shen Qiao had been lost, had been at a loss, and had been deeply wounded by the betrayal of his loved ones. But in this moment, his heart was at peace. He'd been at peace before, as Shrendu Mountain sect leader, but that was the peace of someone who'd never suffered setbacks. The peace he felt now came after he was lashed by winds and rains, beset by defeat and hardships. After the tumult of a storm on the sea, the moon rises high above the clouds, painting the water and the heavens in one color. No billows or swells, no joy or sorrow. In late spring, the thick brush grows. Early autumn sees the layered clouds drift. Within the well, a lone lamp shines. Upon the colored glaze does the moonlight glint. Shen Qiao discerned the sequence of those three strikes, and his hands became as lotus flowers, opening and closing in an instant as he countered one after the other with rising waves form blue mountains, the sun and moon reside within, and auspicious clouds roll in from the east, all from the azure wave sword technique. No Shrendu Mountain disciples could have recognized them as azure wave sword technique moves, because in Shen Qiao's hands, they'd been completely transformed. But if Qi Fengge were alive to see, he'd easily recognize that Shen Qiao's moves were no longer constrained to the maneuvers themselves, that they diverged even from the ways of sword qi and reached the echelon of sword intent. The sword was the king of all weapons, and always had been deeply revered in martial arts. Nearly all practitioners in the Jianghu used swords. For many of them, their swordplay was nowhere near masterful and certainly didn't approach any kind of echelon. There were four echelons of the sword: sword qi, sword intent, sword heart, and sword spirit. When someone could manipulate the sword with qi, then they'd achieve the echelon of sword qi. All Xiantian experts could do this. Before Shen Qiao lost his martial arts, he could too. He was extraordinarily talented. He grew up practicing with the sword, and by the age of 20, he'd already grown beyond the physical maneuvers when it came to the sword moves and entered the echelon of sword qi. Later, when Qi Fengge passed down a volume of Zhuyang strategy to him, he found within that scroll a method to condone true qi and combine it with the sword qi, which improved his swordplay more and more. If nothing had gone wrong, it would have only been a matter of time before he reached the echelon of sword intent. But then he was challenged to a duel at Banbu Peak. Shen Qiao fell from the cliff, and everything came to an abrupt end. If it weren't for a wisp of Zhuyang strategy's true qi that still remained in his body, granting him a chance to start over, the martial arts he'd painstakingly cultivated during the first half of his life would have vanished with the wind. Shen Qiao didn't fall, even as Yan Wusher pressed harder and harder. Instead, he rose to the echelon of sword intent. Yan Wusher, always perceptive, took notice of the change and was greatly surprised. Not only surprised, excited as well. When he'd forced Shen Qiao to fight him, it was only because Shen Qiao still carried the Zhuyang strategy's true qi. Yan Wusher hoped that fighting him would spark the inspiration he needed in order to grasp the essence of the Zhuyang strategy and complete his self-made martial arts. So the stronger his opponent was, the happier he became. At that moment, Shen Xiao's heart was tranquil and completely at peace. His mind had also entered an entirely new state after reaching the echelon of sword intent. It was clear, boundless, and indescribably profound. It was a vast world where the ocean embraced hundreds of rivers, where cliffs soared thousands of meters into the sky. And it was a narrow world, with mere inches on which to move and no foothold to be found. But where the sword intent lay, the principle of Tao also lay. One begets two, two begets three, and three begets all things. There was no ground beneath his feet, but from his steps came the ground. There was no light to be seen, but his heart itself possessed light. In a state like that, Shen Qiao didn't need to see. He could clearly sense the trajectory of his opponent's strikes. He waited quietly. Yan Wushi pointed a finger between his brows. Shen Qiao didn't retreat. He raised his hand to meet it. His right hand lifted, his spread palm perfectly blocking that one finger. In an instant, the nearby stones were sundered into rubble that streaked like shooting stars against the backdrop of the night. All Shen Qiao felt was a roaring whine within his ears. Then blood spilled from his nose and mouth. His entire body flew backwards against his will, slamming into a mighty tree trunk before landing heavily on the ground. Yan Wushi made an incredulous sound, but his expression was deeply impressed. He'd used at least half of his strength. Shen Xiao's damaged foundations remained, even though he'd reached the echelon of sword intent. It was amazingly impressive that he'd caught Yan Wushi's strike and blocked it, instead of just dying on the spot. That alone demonstrated that Shen Qiao's aptitude and potential were indeed remarkable. He was able to reach the echelon of sword intent even though he was still reeling from betrayal. No wonder Qi Fengge had chosen this man as his successor. But although Shen Qiao wasn't dead, he wasn't far from it. It should have been impossible for him to withstand a direct blow from Yan Wushi's finger, but he'd taken it anyway. On top of that, there were injuries he'd suffered during his fight with Yu Ai on Xuandu Mountain. He was well past the point of exhaustion. With all his strength now sapped, he passed out. Yan Wushi bent down and grasped his chin. Shen Xiao's face was like cold jade, horribly white and dull. Even his lips were bloodless, devoid of all color. It looked like he might stop breathing at any moment. But ever since his fall from the cliff, he looked like that 9 days out of 10. The only difference now was that it looked somewhat more serious. But within all this bloodless pallor, with his eyes tightly shut and his long lashes fanned like feathers, there lingered a trace of frail, ascetic beauty. And now that he was unconscious, it was even meeker and lovelier. It was precisely this docile appearance that had misled Mu Tipo that day at the inn, when he'd confused this man-eating flower for a daughter herb. But this flower was good-natured, always tender-hearted and compassionate. That's why it met with trouble after trouble. It seemed to bring all this trouble on itself, but it also anticipated and accepted the consequences of such tenderness. If others thought that softness was a weakness, then it was they who were truly blind. Look at how exhausting your tragic life is, said Yan Wushi. Your master is dead. Your position as sect leader was stolen. All the martial siblings you grew up with either betrayed you or disapproved of your methods. Your family and friends deserted you, and you were gravely injured, forced to leave Xuandu Mountain. Now you are nothing. Yan Wushi whispered right by Shen Qiao's ear, coaxing him with the softest tone. But there's no need to live a life that tragic. As long as you enter the noble discipline with me and cultivate the Fenglan scriptures, I will pass my volume of Zhuyang strategy on to you. When the time comes, you won't just regain your martial arts. It'll be only a matter of time before you progress even further. It'll be far faster than the 3 or 5 years it takes to recover by yourself. After that, whether you want to take back your position as sect leader or kill Yu Ai in revenge, it'll be no trouble at all. What do you think? This was the time when Shun Qiao's will was at its weakest. He was dazed, devoid of the strength to resist with his body, and susceptible to invasion of his mind. Shun Qiao had even instilled his words with demonic persuasion and repeated them in Shun Qiao's ear again and again. They crept straight to his heart, pounding mercilessly at his Taoist core. Shun Qiao frowned in pain, and his body struggled a little. But Yan Wushi didn't let go, just repeated his words again. Yu Ai allied with Kunye. Because of them, you fell from the cliff and lost all your martial arts. Don't you hate them? Without your martial arts, without your status, even capering clowns like Chen Gong and Mu Tipo dared to make a fool of you. Does your heart really hold not even a whit of hatred? Don't you want to kill them? I can help you with that too. To a passerby, they'd look like two people intimately murmuring to each other, acting flirtatious and seductive. Of course, it wasn't like that at all. The force behind Yan Wushi's finger grew and grew, digging into Shun Qiao's chin until red marks bloomed. They'd probably bruise the next day, but that wasn't why Shun Qiao was suffering. It was those demonic words pouring into his ears over and over. He couldn't escape them, couldn't avoid them. He clenched his teeth hard, and though he'd already lost consciousness, a thread of his subconscious seemed to bind him firmly, preventing him from saying yes. The moment he said yes, he would begin to lose his conscience. Why not agree? Yan Wushi coaxed. It's only a single word. Just say it, and I'll do anything for you. I don't want to become that kind of person. Even if it must be done, I should be the one to do it. Become what kind of person? What's wrong with taking an eye for an eye? If you want to kill someone, then kill them. Besides, they betrayed you first. You don't owe them anything. Shun Qiao shook his head. A fresh trickle of blood seeped from the corner of his mouth, and the expression on his face grew more and more pained. Any ordinary person would have succumbed to such torture by now, but he refused to speak. Some people were unaware of the evil in the world and gave their kindness indiscriminately. In the end, all it did was exhaust them and others both. But there were some people who did see through to the evil, and that insight was precisely why they refused to change, why they carried on being gentle and tender-hearted. But it was human nature to be evil. Could someone really withstand hundreds upon thousands of trials and hardships and still not change their mind? Yan Wushi chuckled quietly, then wiped the blood away from Shun Qiao's mouth. Sweeping his hand beneath Shun Qiao's arm, he lifted him off the ground and headed into town. All right, everyone, that concludes the reading of chapters 19 through 22. I have to say, things got pretty intense in my mind's eye. Just the way that Yu Ai ended up trying to force Shen Qiao to stay, but like, I totally agree with him. He would only be kept prisoner there, and honestly, Yu Ai would probably continuously poison him or put something in his food or drink or in a candle that wafts, smoke in the air to keep him from fully recovering, so that way he could never fight against him. But also, I really, really just loved chapter 22. Seeing Yan Wushi and Shen Qiao get into a fight with one another, intentionally, obviously. I love that Shen Qiao agreed, and in the moment, honestly, on page 240, you saw that both of them were actually enjoying themselves. Yan Wushi was excited to have an opponent who, was clearly advancing, even though Shen Qiao still wasn't at his level. He was quite impressed by him and had no choice but to acknowledge Shen Qiao's extraordinary talent. And Shen Qiao himself was feeling very at peace and very calm. And I just love that moment. It wasn't about them being friends or enemies or anything about that. It was just simply them engaging in battle with one another and finding their own chemistry within themselves, within their own fighting techniques. Yeah, honestly, I just loved it so much. So, anyway, I hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.